podcast focused on trends shaping the future of manufacturing. I'm Alexandria Burek, your host, here with A.W. Schultz, two thought leaders with a passion for people and manufacturing. Today and every episode, we are diving deep into the advancements, sustainable practices, and dynamic changes transforming how we produce everything.
And now welcome Alexandria Burek and A.W. Schultz.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Factory of the Future. I'm here with A.W. Schultz. I'm Alexandria Burek. And today we're going to be time traveling back to the 70s, the peak of manufacturing in the United States, notably the period of time in which the most Americans were employed in a manufacturing profession. So, A.W., what can you tell us about what was going on in the 70s? And we'll get into some of the other huge shifts in manufacturing and general corporate attitudes towards the people.
Yeah, thanks, Alexandria. And the one thing is, the Factory of the Future, we try to look at the past to understand where the future is going. So in this episode, we're talking about the 1970s. So this is a transition from the computer age, really, where we started to see digitalization, sensors, robotics were becoming even more prevalent, particularly in the automotive industries. And it was similar to, it was building on to the 1960s. Again, the Toyota was kind of leading the way on some of these advancements in lean practices and, incorporating people in the process and driving some of the results that way. So as I looked at it, there was, Alexandria had mentioned on a previous episode that the manufacturing jobs community had been rising for some time. We had a little bit of recessions in 1973 with the oil crisis, and but by 1979 we had reached our peak, which up to this day is still the peak as far as most jobs out there in the manufacturing community at 19.6 million. Yeah. In that respect. Toyota production system, the introduction of waste elimination. We had done an episode on the 8 types of waste, and that was one of those things. Just in time, there was the big push of how often you could have something if you didn't have to hold on to it as far as inventory, and just a constant evolution of continuous improvement on it.
So the 70s was really the birth of continuous improvement, and a lot of the core manufacturing processes and lean methodology that most companies are still using today. Also notably in the 70s, peak, obviously, like we talked about, peak of American manufacturing with 19 million people employed by the manufacturing industry and holding those jobs. What I think is also important to share is that the 70s was also the turning point for the view of corporations towards the employee. So up till the 70s, there was this cradle to grave care that the employer typically took the burden of. Employees were seen as valuable long-term assets. Companies wanted to provide benefits to their employees to reduce turnover. So that's where this kind of boomer idea of, commitment, you stick with the company from start to finish, you get a gold watch. This is the gold watch era that everyone is talking about. And this almost paternalistic attitude that employers had towards their employees really started to shift in the 70s. There were some policy, like United States policy changes, that really shifted the attitude of corporations negatively towards the employees. So where they actually, the employers typically really cared about their employees. They provided pensions, benefit plans, insurance premiums were provided as part of the benefit of working these defined benefit plans. And, the employees were given guaranteed fixed retirement payout. The company assumed the risk of the investments. This is all the period in which these things shifted. So prior to the 70s, the employer took on the expense and the risk. And then in the beginning of the 80s, that's when the employee started taking on that risk. And that was really driven by the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. So what that basically did in 1974 was it made it much more expensive for companies to give these generous benefits to their employees. And that's what really drove the change in the corporation's attitude towards the employer. And that's when the corporation started to offload the risk and expense of retirement plans and insurance from the employer to the employee. So much of what we all experience today, for those of us who are employed full-time, like in a W-2 scenario, the era of the 70s is when the 401ks were born, when your HMO, PPO insurance plans were born, and when that risk and that expense was transferred from the corporation to the employee. And this was, again, driven by policy, the American government policy changes. So I guess on one hand, you can empathize with the corporations because it wasn't something they did without kind of this U.S. government kind of prompt and change in the policy landscape. But I guess that also leads us kind of back full circle to where we are now. Even with the increased focus of Industry 5.0 going back to the employee, I don't think we're ever going to see the era of pensions and this paternalistic commitment to employees ever return. So it's a bit of a sad fact for those of us in the workforce today and those coming behind us.
Yeah, we talked in the 60s, there was a big push for unionization. And, some of these programs were to reduce the need for unionization, so that they're saying that, I think the companies felt that, let's give them other benefits that maybe they necessarily didn't think about at the time, or looking at some of those things you talked about, the long term on it. And we've had other episodes where we talk about, today it's the average tenure at a company is 2 to 3 years. And, back in this time, it was, like you said, it was career. So from a manufacturing point of view, you could still buy some of the things that were still manufactured back in the 1970s or earlier than that, but the process of doing it is probably quite a bit different than what you might have imagined what they were seeing.
One of the things that, as you were talking, I was trying to figure out is how did the average employee tenure change from the 60s to present day? So in the 60s, what I think is interesting is that on average, it was about 4.6 years per employee. So what I'm saying is, in the 60s, people stayed with companies for about 4.5 years on average. And again, that's an average. In the 80s, that bumped slightly higher, up to almost 5 years. But then when we look into the early 80s and then on, that's when tenure dropped to like 3, and now it's back to 3 or 4 years in current times. So not what I would have expected to see based on kind of the way that everybody talks about long-term tenure in the past versus current. Really doesn't seem that much different. And I that makes me think about our episode on TPM, total productive management, right?
Maintenance. Yeah.
Maintenance or management. And we made the argument that because employees are turning over so much faster, those programs don't necessarily make sense. But I think what really would be driving that is just the patience of people. Like, I think everybody wants more instant. So I think the attitude currently is not necessarily driven by lack of employee tenure, but more just faster ROI turnaround, smaller projects with quicker turnaround versus bigger projects with longer turnaround times. What else about the 70s, AW? What else do you have for us?
Increased semiconductor automation. OSHA was starting to get really popular, so that's a good thing, and improved workplace safety. So just to your points on some of the other benefits is they started. I'm now that we're talking about this, I see like the 70s and possibly today is kind of the similarities, is that they were touching on the people part of it a little bit more than what we would saw in the 60s and earlier. And then I don't think there was a big push there was a big push in the later years but we'll be talking about those later on. So that's kind of the 1970s, and that's it. So you want to carry us out?
Are we out of here like finished goods?
We're out of here like finished goods. Yep.
Cool.
This is Factory of the Future, and we are out of here like finished goods. Stay tuned for our next episode of Factory of the Future, where we're exploring groundbreaking techniques and behaviors that are reshaping industrial landscapes. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review and help others discover the cutting-edge insights transforming manufacturing as we know it.